General of the CBI, and we're really grateful to Emma McClarkin, the Chief Executive of the Beer and Pub Association, and Jason Sidthorpe, who's the UK President of Avison Young, for joining us. Emma and Jason, I'm going to do what I typically do on a Monday morning. It feels like every week is like an incredibly important week, and again, it feels the same this week. But I'm going to talk to Tony just for a bit about what he's hearing on the business side, and also a little bit of understanding what's happening in the pitch rolling on the budget, and then come to you in a moment, because I think this morning's conversation is really trying to understand how businesses are digesting the Prime Minister's plan for the roadmap, what's working, what's not, what's clear, what's not. And in that spirit, I hope everyone who's joining us on the call this morning will feel free to raise either their concerns or their contributions in the chat, and I'll try and bring them into Tony, and I'll certainly make sure that the CBI team, or I know the CBI team, picks up on them and responds directly. But Tony, why don't we start? I can't believe that we're still just digesting what's going on in that roadmap, but I imagine you've had a lot of conversations with business in the last week who are beginning to try and understand who goes back when, what that means. What are you hearing from business?
Yeah, look, it's really a two-part story, right? It's a tale of two cities, depending on where you are. We'll hear from Emma in a minute and her members. For them, it's clearly too slow. For the aviation sector, it's clearly too slow. For the live events sector, it's clearly too slow. And by the way, for all the supply chains for those sectors, it's too slow. So they're feeling deeply worried. Really good news, I think, and Emma will talk about it, I'm sure, this £5 billion package of grants to help some of the hospitality sector and other sectors sort of get through the next few months while we're waiting to reopen, although that doesn't quite catch the supply chains to those sectors, by the way. But so I think there are some people who have turned around and thought, gosh, another few months without really being able to open, without really being able to see a path to profitability, with quite a lot of lack of clarity around even demand in those sectors, even if you could reopen. So there's some grave concerns about that. At the same time, when you speak to businesses not in those sectors, I think they think on balance it's quite good. They think it's a fair enough trade-off to think if we can avoid the stop-start, if this cautious managed approach will get us there, then it's worth the delays in order to get there. So I think, mixed reaction. I can come on to the universe of questions people now have, but I would say that's probably, depending on the sector you're in, you'll have a different reaction to the roadmap.
Can you talk a bit about that universe of questions, Tony? Because I was reflecting on the conversation we had about testing and tracing in the workplace, and how once you've got past the first sort of 3 minutes of shared enthusiasm about the endeavour, it all gets complicated pretty quickly, and it feels the same around kind of the emergence from lockdown. There are quite a lot of questions about exactly who's allowed to do what when. I just wondered what you're hearing and how you think the CBI helps get some greater clarity.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, first of all, it's important to remember that it's different for devolved administrations. We now have 4 nations of England doing things entirely differently. Scotland going a bit slower, Northern Ireland not opening for a while, Wales also managing it differently. And therefore, everybody needs to think about their own, depending on where you are, you've got different rules. And we'll come back to our old favorite chestnut. We'll have members on this call who'll be operating across jurisdictions who'll now be feeling there's a lot to accommodate here. Look, I think what are we focused on? So, and you've raised some of them. Number one, safer working guidance, right? So BEIS have agreed to just consult again on whether or not all the workplace guidance still applies. And we're working with them on that. I'm delighted after pushing them on that for a few months, they're going to proceed with that, and I think that will be important. We're working on that. That will come out soon. Secondly, you're right, maximizing workplace testing. Workplace testing is still a big part of the picture. Remember, we had Dido on here talking about the need to follow new variants. We've heard about Brazil this morning. So workplace testing will be part of the mix. Really chuffed that in the roadmap, the government have agreed to keep on funding workplace testing for firms 50 employees and above till the end of June. However, please note, you do need to register by the end of March. So if you want to get aspects to that support, obviously if you're less than 50, unfortunately you're still in that bracket of having to go to community testing sites. There are 4 reviews set up in the roadmap, just so everybody's clear. One, this passport certification. We can talk about that if you want, but we'll be working with Michael Gove on that. There's one of the things we're doing around the other reviews is this global travel review, which Grant Shapps is leading. That's really important to our aviation clients, aviation members. It's also really important to the aviation supply chain. It's also important to any international business. We've had lots of members who've got, people stuck trying to service contracts in different parts of Europe and so on. And also the social distancing review, which is a really important review for the kind of stuff I think Jason's going to talk about, which is, can we reopen the economy? Can we go back to workplaces, 2 meters, 1 meter, etc.? That's really important. By the way, we're going to do our own little piece of review as well around the event sector. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to try and get this going, and our overriding objective is that if the government set out a framework now for when and how we're going to reopen, let's make sure we reopen with confidence. I think what we want to avoid now that we've got the timing to prep is this idea that we reopen, everyone's a bit confused, everybody's scrambling around for clarity, and therefore the reopening is a bit of a damp squib. I think what we want is to reopen with confidence, reopen with guidance, reopen with preparation. And I think our job in the next few months is to help members do that because we'll push the government hard on exactly the kind of detail that people need. So please, on this call and through our usual coronavirus hub, please give us your feedback about the questions you need answered, because we need the whole economy to reopen strong.
Can I just, Tony, before we just turn to the budget, one thing I just wanted to replay to you, the comment you made about supply chain struck a chord with Michael Hurst, who just makes the point that once again, the £5 billion package is for business rated premises. As Tony says, as you say, the supply chain to sectors like events are mostly uncovered by the support, and ask the question, what's the use of premises being saved if they have no services to supply them? And just one other thing, just a flag, just an ask of the CBI on providing help with the test and trace program, or the testing program, workplace testing, is it's quite resource heavy, people are saying. I imagine it is, particularly for smaller businesses. I know that we had RWE on, there are a couple of thousand people working there. For smaller businesses, having the person and just the extent to which the CBI can help provide support, home support for workplace testing. I just want to register those things with you.
On the first one, we'll come on to that, but you're right. We do have an issue around sector-specific support not being horizontal. Now, of course, when we come on to the budget, we'll talk about whether or not the broad package the Chancellor has in place for all firms will continue. But yeah, look, we hear you. We've been making this case. We'll continue to make the case. And on that second issue around workplace testing, yeah, we're going to try and make sure that our hub has continuous sort of guidance around workplace testing, and as usual, sharing what people are doing. One of our big objectives is to try and find a way that the market price for these tests can come down and be stabilized so that people don't have such variation. And then we will try and do our best to share advice on our hub around how are people deploying this well. You'll know, I think we've talked about it before, when we surveyed members on this, probably 30 or 40% of our members said actually what was holding them back was because they just weren't clear on how to deliver this well. And we will do our best on the hub to give as much information as we can. And also, listen, if you have got over 50 employees, I really would encourage you by the end of March to register with BAYS to get the guidance and the financial support to do this well.
Yeah. And Tony, one other thing, just before, as I said before, the budget, which is that Jack Semple has asked a question, and I suspect I'll come to this with Jason in a moment too, but saying on workplace guidance, right? We've been asked by BAYS to highlight that there is no change to work from home guidance until at least June the 21st. Is that now up for review? Is that right? I'm actually not clear on that.
Yes, I believe that's right, but I think they are trying to think about new workplace guidance if required. So yes, people should assume that the existing workplace guidance is the guidance, and then we will see changes emerge potentially, and hopefully those changes will be around loosening up restrictions.
Right. Okay. Jason, I'm going to come to you on that in a minute, because I think it's quite confusing, the change from stay-at-home rules but still work from home. So we'll discuss that in a moment. But let's just talk about the budget. I love this period, Tony, the run-up to the budget, when there's all this sort of pitch rolling, isn't there? You know, you leak a few things here, you get a former chancellor to say something there, and you frame the speech that's going to be given on Wednesday. What's your reading of the last few days and where that's heading for business and the chancellor's message for business?
Yeah, look, I think we're looking at a three-part budget, right? The first part of the budget, I think, will be around COVID support. It'll be, you know, as I've called it, part two of the roadmap, because part one was great, but we now have 10 days waiting to hear part two. And particularly if you're some of Emma's members, then that's a really anxious 10 days. So I think we'll hear about COVID support and the extension of the packages. I think we'll hear quite a lot about long-term growth of the economy. I think the Chancellor has done a lot of thinking. I've certainly spoken to him a few times about long-term growth and what needs to be in there, and I think he'll talk about that. And so I think we'll hear about, you know, some of those reviews that he's done, listings review, fintech review. I think some of that stuff, some thoughts about leveling up, some infrastructure. You know, we're waiting to hear news on the infrastructure bank. I think a lot of that stuff that we've been working with Treasury on for 6 months, you've heard us talk about, I think that will come to fruition. And then, you know, you've got the meat of how we're going to stimulate business investment whilst at the same time starting to tackle the debt. The Chancellor is personally keen, I think that's clear to us from all the briefing that we've seen and from my conversations with him, to start thinking about bringing down the debt. There's obviously a disagreement between business and the Chancellor about when to start looking at business taxes through corporation tax. We can talk about that if you'd like. But I think the Chancellor, in my conversations with him, absolutely buys that the real test of this budget is, do we stimulate business confidence, stimulate business investment, stimulate growth and jobs, or do we stifle them? And that's really the test of the budget. And so, look, I think he's got quite a hard budget call ahead of him, but I think he's done, and the team have done there, quite a lot of work to make sure that the pro-business investment measures are part of the mix, and tax remains one of the things we're all waiting for.
And I know, Tony, that on Thursday morning we've got a CBI at 10. Ray Newton-Smith will be here, chief economist, to pick over the bones of the budget. And I suppose that's really the time to make a judgment on the tax decisions, which we know are going to be signalled, or we expect to be signalled. Kind of one thing, business investment. Right. The truth is that for a decade we worried about productivity in the UK and talked about business investment. Do you feel, in the conversations you've had with the Chancellor, that he's got a theory of the case about how business investment works, where to channel those kinds of incentives or those kinds of tax breaks so that you really get the best possible outcome in terms of business growth and productivity?
Well, I hope so, because that is mostly what we have talked about, exactly that, right? And listen, it's not like there's one single answer to business investment, and Britain hasn't been doing it all these years. But a couple of thoughts about business investment. The first one is, yes, Britain's been serially bad at it, but it is very much my view and our view that there's a real moment in time here. You know, I think that for 4 or 5 years, Brexit was constraining business investment, and that uncertainty, that's gone. I mean, not that Brexit is certain, but it's done, and we have a framework. Post-COVID, I think there's a sense that, particularly with vaccination going well, there's a real opportunity. For a lot of companies, they have stored quite a lot of cash. And so I do believe this is a pretty unique moment, a sort of window in a generation moment, to really make a boost on stimulating business investment. Now, there are a lot of ways in which it's affected, right? Business rates for us is a big curtailment on business investment, and that one's been kicked into touch for 6 months, which is a shame. Corporation tax can be a stimulus for business investment. You know, sometimes the corporation tax debate, when you hear it discussed, is like either you've got a lot of very rich companies making supernatural profits over here, or you've got the vast number of the economy not making much profit. Actually, the truth is, in between are most firms in the economy who make some profit and use profits to reinvest. That's why it's important to think about corporation tax with great care. But there are lots of other ways to stimulate business investment. And, you know, above all, one of the most important ways to think about it is, can we provide a certainty of planning environment for investment? And that's why stuff like, you know, the Green 10-point plan, some real details around infrastructure, That kind of clarity and that kind of investment from government unlocks business investment. So look, it's a bit of a recipe, and that's why on Wednesday afternoon, the judgment, we'll be sitting around as the CBI going, net, does this create stimulus for business investment, or does it stifle business investment? That's the test of the budget.
Well, okay, Tony, thank you. I want to bring in Emma and Jason, but let's stay in the conversation about the practicalities of returning to work. I was on a call Friday afternoon, Emma, with a group of people, and someone said just in passing, you know, imagine we're in a bar, and then stopped himself and said, actually, why don't we just stop and just imagine that for a little while? And we all sat quietly, imagining we were in a bar. I imagine many of your members are sitting thinking, okay, well, imagine we're in a bar, and trying to think through the practicalities now of reopening. Can you give us a little of the sense of what are the preoccupations of people who are trying to manage for that?
They're trying to find a way to survive through to opening the door again. That's first and foremost in their minds. You know, that cash burn effect for their business in the background is huge, and that's why it's so positive that we're hearing this new reopening grant being announced by the Chancellor, because it will actually save businesses that wouldn't have made it through to April the 12th or indoor opening on May the 17th. So first of all, is still survival. Of course, the next part is reactivating that supply chain, and having dates is enormously important for any business, but at least they can now begin to plan to get their supply chain open. But what is really difficult for our members right now is predicting the volume of people that they'll be serving, and particularly with outdoor opening, it's heavily restricted. There's only 40% of our pubs that have any viable space to open, for example. So many pubs will choose to remain closed. If they do open, of course, the inclement weather, their customers will have to go home if it starts to rain. There's nowhere else to put them. So how do you start brewing? And at what volumes do you predict people coming through the door? And that is very, very difficult for us right now as we're trying to reopen those businesses. Of course, putting in place those guidance and the safer workplace guidance that Tony was talking about, and making sure our environments are COVID secure, that is happening already. People are already making sure that those environments are there. But really, it's just thinking about how long is this road to profitability for us? How long is it going to take for us to win back the confidence of the public and to actually have those restrictions drop away to allow us a chance to make a profit?
And Emma, what's your read for the 60%? Right, for the 60% of people who just have no path to a viable business until meaningfully the early summer?
Yeah, it was very, very bleak. You know, when we announced the roadmap, it was extremely disappointing that we only had an outdoor opening, and that so many of our businesses were going to have to wait for the longer date. And then, of course, remember, that is under heavy restrictions still. So we're still not able to get to break even under those conditions, but we want to reconnect our businesses and our communities again. They've desperately missed being the heart and soul of their communities and want to find a way to do it. But of course, they've got to run a business at the end of the day. And how long can you do that without being able to have a chance at making some kind of profit or even get to break even? So this grant will really support those businesses in that period of time. But if you think about the rejuvenation of our high streets, for example, many of our high streets pubs are those venues that don't have that outdoor space to make viable their business. And so it will take a lot longer to regenerate and bring back to life our town centres and our high streets again. So there will be definitely different speeds of recovery in different parts of the country, depending on that. And of course, going back to the office in the city, the two go together. You know, the rejuvenation of our city venues when we don't have international travel will be dependent on people coming back to the office.
And Emma, what's the position on 1 metre, 1.5 metres, 2 metres, the debate on distancing?
Well, we're 1 metre plus, and we know that we're going to have to operate under 1 metre plus until the 21st of June, when social contact restrictions will fall away. And that, at least that is the hope. And from that moment on, therefore, it's really important that we try to enshrine the 21st of June, because then businesses can really predict how much they can trade at. The capacity level reduction because of social distancing is immediately 30% down, if not up to sometimes 50, even 60% in some venues, depending on their layout. So that immediately has that economic impact on those venues. So operating under it, yes we can, and of course we will, for as long as that we are told that we have to. But the reality is it has to fall away at some point. We have to be able to trade under our normal business model and remove that restriction on capacity in terms of making good on last year's losses, number one, rebuilding ourselves back up, number two, and then hopefully at some point in the future looking and signposting to future growth.
Tony flagged up the question about vaccine certification. I'd just be interested to know what you hear from your members around this, whether or not, I imagine the opinion's divided, but I'd be interested to know what people think.
It is a difficult one, I have to say. We've had several discussions, and Tony will know this, over many, many months in and around vaccine passports, vaccine certifications, and they were largely dismissed, I have to say, by ministers back in earlier months of this year. So to have them come back around now, I feel that maybe we've lost a bit of time in terms of if that was a solution that they were genuinely going to look at. They should have invested in it maybe some time ago for it to be able to kick in enough time to allow us to reopen with confidence and to do what it's supposed to do. So at this stage, we feel that we've got our reopening dates. We know that we'll be operating under restrictions. Of course, we'll engage with future solutions as they come along, but I don't feel that this one is really going to be ready in time to impact us at this moment.
Tony, can I just ask you what you're hearing on that and what your view is on it?
Yeah, look, I spoke to about 200 members last week about this, and look, this is where I think they are. Number one, can we, can we try and make it work? Yes, but first of all, it has to be temporary. The idea of, people are conscious of the civil liberties and philosophical questions, but more if this is a long-run thing. Right, so the parallel I heard came up a few times is this can't be like 9/11, post 9/11 airport security, where all of a sudden everybody's now walking around carrying health cards. If there's a kind of, for this window in time, people have got something to be able to reopen the economy, that's a good thing. I think really people are worried about the minefield of implementing it. I mean, the legal minefield, the implementation minefield. I mean, I spoke to some of Emma's members who said, when we were trying to require people to wear masks in pubs, and somebody would show up and say, well, I've got asthma, so I don't need to wear one. And you said, well, prove to me you had asthma. I mean, it just, it wasn't the way to run a business. And we saw the problems the supermarkets had with trying to sort of compel people to wear masks. So what I've said to government is, even before you start to get great professors and theologians debating the philosophy of this, work out how you would do it. Is it doable? Can it be implemented? Talk to Emma's members, talk to the supermarkets, talk to the restaurants, because at the moment people feel if this can help us reopen, then it's definitely a good thing. But it's a minefield to execute. So that's, I think, the biggest question before we get on to great philosophy.
The thing that I think is, clearly you can see that it's coming in the area of travel. The reason why I was interested to know from you, Emma, is that in the area of hospitality, you've already seen that there's there's much greater level of public support for vaccine certification amongst people in, for example, social care. Anywhere where you have that interaction with people, and you could well understand that if you worked in the hospitality or in the restaurant and pub trade, you as an employee would want to know that your other colleagues were also vaccinated, and as an employer that might be a reasonable thing. So I wonder whether or not, if not vaccinations, but if not vaccine certification for customers, for employees. And Emma, I don't know whether you've heard anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're having these discussions right now, but it again, for us, is we've got a reopening date. We'll be opening on the 12th of May outdoors and opening on the 17th of May indoors. Is this program going to be up and running before we get to that stage? I don't think it will be. So therefore, for other industries that are not open, I can understand that the attraction is it will accelerate that reopening for them. For us, I don't feel it's going to be arriving in time, and then it would almost be a retrospective act. In terms of that, of course, we'll be considering the options and if that seems to be viable. But it is, again, an enforcement issue and a civil liberties one, having to ask people. And then there's the ability to go and get those vaccinations. I mean, we did see in the US actually that they prioritized hospitality workers to go and get those vaccines, but that was ahead of people within other categories. So, we need to be very, very careful here about how we're looking at the vaccination rollout and then how that would fit in with certain sectors perhaps being given this ahead of others. But that is not something that we're pushing for.
Yeah.
James,
Yeah, sorry, Tony.
Two things on this. First of all, I think if it's going to happen anytime soon, you would do it with testing as well, right? So you either need evidence of being tested and had a negative test, or being vaccinated. And just your point about employees is really interesting, and this I think will be relevant to Jason's area. I've spoken to members in the last few weeks, some of the big retailers, about the employee testing programs that they've had in the workplace. And the real conclusion is that when you've got very high levels of compliance with workplace testing, everybody feels very comfortable at work, right? There is definitely the boost you describe from employees feeling much better about work because they know that everyone is being tested. And that has increased reassurance in the workplace. So I would imagine that the same applies for vaccination. And if for people that won't be able to be vaccinated in the future, some kind of testing regime will be part of the mix.
Thanks, Tony. Jason, thank you for waiting quite so patiently. I want actually to go back right to Tony's point right at the beginning about, tale of two cities, two economies, the kind of eagerness of Emma's members, not to mention customers, to get back and get open quickly. But the caution that you're finding, I know Avison Young, you probably have quite a good line of sight to a lot of different commercial properties and different, enterprises. How much are you finding people reluctant, even let's say by June the 21st? What kind of occupancy rates do you think we'll see in offices?
Yeah, so I think the occupancy rates, even after June the 21st, I can't see them growing much beyond 60–70%, and I don't see us going back to 100% potentially until towards the end of the year. But that won't necessarily just be because of the impact of COVID. It will be because of the impact of what we are going to do around agile working within the workplace as well, and new flex policies that will undoubtedly come in across many parts of the business. But to Emma's point around the speed of accelerating this roadmap, because on one hand we're talking about working from home and less essential not to until June, but we're starting to open up the retail and hospitality economy in April and May. So that doesn't align there, and that I think would create a huge concern. So I think we need to try and find ways to look at how we can accelerate the return to office across the whole of our business landscape. I think the vaccination certification is great in principle, but the speed of which people are going to get vaccinated throughout those priority groups are probably going to negatively impact the benefit, the speed of benefit we see from that. So to Tony's point, I do feel that the testing within the workplace is perhaps a more immediate and robust route to go to help encourage people back into the office.
And do you think, Jason, just in practical terms for people running offices, that we're misreading June the 21st? I see some people in the chat as we were speaking are saying, look, it may be the case that the restrictions end, but social distancing, these kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions continue. So are you thinking that we'll continue to have quote unquote COVID secure offices through the course of the year?
Yeah, so I think that we're kind of still in the laboratory at the moment, and we've got many businesses now trying to assess what their people strategies are and how that's going to define the workplace of the future. And as I said, we are going to undoubtedly see more agility and flexibility. So we won't necessarily have as many people coming into the towns and cities to their workplace as we've seen previously. But I mean, as an employer, we're doing all we can now to really encourage and to point out the benefits and the importance of being in the office. Whilst of course we will celebrate and we'll find ways to champion that increased flexibility, we do know that when you are working from home for such a long period, of course it impacts productivity. It absolutely impacts innovation, creativity, collaboration within the businesses as well. So there's a need for all business owners, operators to ensure that they are working with their colleagues, undertaking meaningful surveys, and really then putting in place operational strategies that will respond to this. But I do believe that post-June, post-COVID, we are going to have a different landscape within our offices regardless.
So I'm really interested in that, Jason, because I had a long and completely circular argument with my cousin over the weekend about whether or not we would or wouldn't ever return to the cinema. I.e., is this a structural change in the way in which people consume entertainment? And around offices, I was really struck by David Solomon, the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, who really, people will have seen that, his comments around working from home and the fact that he wants to get everyone back into the office as quickly as possible, and everyone, not so focused on this agility, but a real office-based culture. From the conversations you have, do you get the sense that the sort of the return to work as it was before is probably underestimated, that more businesses are going to go back to their old ways of working?
Well, everyone talks about the new normal. And I think we firstly need to make sure we don't misinterpret what the new normal means. The reality is there'll always be a plethora of new normals because every business sector, industry, that they're all unique. And you talk about David Solomon, and he referred to working from home as an aberration. But also last week, you saw HSBC confirm that they're going to be reducing their office space by 40%. So neither of those approaches or positions are incorrect. They just reflect their own operational and people strategies. So, I mean, to try and give a bit more context, we originally undertook a survey called Fit for Future. And we surveyed over 100 senior professionals in charge of occupational states. And 98% believe that health and well-being is now going to be if not the core driver for workplace strategy. And 78% believe that they need to change and adapt their existing workplace to accommodate that. So we are going to see change, but different businesses, different industries are going to have very different approaches based on what they need to drive optimum productivity from their workforce. And just in terms of the conversation you had over the weekend about ever returning to the cinema, the conversation I had over the weekend was, will we ever shake hands again, or will we continue with the fist bumps?
What was the conclusion on that?
I'm very keen to shake hands and hug.
Jason, can I just, sitting here and looking at my screen and seeing you and Emma together, it makes me think one thing about the changing office workplace and the culture of offices, because this point about health and well-being, one of the things that's perhaps most surprising, I started out as a business reporter, the idea that you'd have leading business people talking endlessly about health and well-being, not least mental health. It's a big change in the culture of business. What around the culture of office space as well? Because it's one thing to say you really care about health and well-being, but you can go to a horrible gym in the basement if you're lucky enough to have a gym in the basement. Do you think there is going to be a real change to the way in which people think about the floor plan, think about the provision of those kind of health and well-being services within office spaces? And if so, can you tell us, because we're all trying to imagine the future, what you think that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, undoubtedly, I don't think I know, and it's something that we, as a commercial real estate advisor, are already doing ourselves, and we're out there giving advice to clients around what that should look like as well. But I think we've got to also remember that health and well-being, it's deeper than the physical accommodation that you provide and the nature of that accommodation and the quality of the breakout space, the collaboration space. I think what's happening now is a much deeper conversation around recognizing that we do all have personal worlds, to really find a way to strike a better balance to the home versus work. Health and well-being is about how you feel within the office space. It is around the support that's given. It's about creating that genuinely diverse and inclusive culture as well. And for me, I think it's wonderful that right now that over the last few years, and probably accelerated by the pandemic, we are giving far more time, energy, and effort to the importance of diversity and inclusion, to the importance of a green recovery, to sustainability, all of these elements, and they all build around giving each firm a purpose as well. That's what drives a culture within an office, within any place of employment. And that hopefully will be one of the key things that will drive people into the office and then support, from Emma's perspective, the retail and hospitality sectors as well.
Joseph, thank you. Emma, can I just do a bit of a handbrake turn, just because there's been a question in the chat, which is one of the recurrent themes actually the last year has been the difference between what central government is saying and what local government is doing. And this was a question actually from someone who works in the catering equipment supply sector, and saying that they'd made applications for support. Some local authorities are granting them and some are not. I didn't know whether this was a one-off or something that you're hearing more widely.
Yeah, no, a big job that we've had at the British Beer and Pub Association has actually been chasing up these grants. So the grants that people are eligible for, that they are entitled to, that have had substantial delays in getting them out. And that makes us very nervous about the new support that's being announced. It must be delivered as soon as it possibly can. We're very pleased to hear that it will be coming in a one-off payment, because, you know, local authorities have been dealing with this with different mechanisms, different processes, different application forms, and it has been very, very slow in some areas. You know, there were league tables actually last year that was ranking the efficiencies of local authorities in getting these grants to the people that desperately need them. I think we need to bring those back actually. But you know, it's really important that people get that access to these grants. And can I just make a point also about state aid? You know, we envisaged the first time that the lockdown and this whole pandemic would be for a 3-month period. Well, here we are nearly a year later, and we're finding ourselves emerging from the third lockdown. So the total of all these grants now is together quite a lot. And state aid has become a big blocker for a lot of access, for pubs particularly that are within a parent company that cannot access this. So we need to make sure that the state aid rules will not apply to these new grants, because they are preventing, you know, thousands of pubs across the country from getting access to these grants.
Oh, that's totally. So on what grounds is it considered state aid?
Well, there's a state aid cap. It was at €800,000, which was then raised to 3 million. But actually, the EU has gone and raised their state aid cap to 10 million now. So, you know, we are quite a way off in the United Kingdom. But it means once you've hit that cap, then any grant support that's above and beyond that, they are unable to claim for it above that limit. So, as you can imagine, there are many people that hit that cap, given the length of time now that we have been closed, and it has become a major block for many of our operators.
Oh, I see. Okay, so interesting, Emerson, because it actually makes me realise that, you know, often you're thinking about these smaller operators, but some of these, you know, large chains and nationwide groups obviously must hit that cap relatively quickly.
They have, and each of those pubs though is a small business in that town or village. So, you know, you're preventing access to that pub to get that level of support.
Jason, can I come back just to a point that's been made, and we touched on this a few weeks ago at one of these CBI 10 meetings, which was around flexibility and fairness. And I'm really interested in this survey work you've done and whether or not anyone is able to tell. This is Lizzie Hills has put this point, and I'm going to read it to you if I might. Has any work been done or questions been asked about diversity when it comes to returning to the office? The view is that the Goldman Sachs decision seems very old-fashioned in a male-dominated sector, and women, however, have proved that a more flexible working environment have thrived in this time at work. And I suppose the question is, I mean, it's threefold, isn't it? Who does flexible working benefit? Who does the return to the office benefit? And the most difficult question of all is the hybrid working model going to actually benefit some rather than others, and if so, whom?
Yes, that's a number of questions, and there is no one answer. In fact, we had our own Avison Young UK conference last week, and we were talking about how we are moving forward and how we are leading in a new hybrid environment and what that means for managing and leading colleagues. And no matter what industry you're in, I wouldn't comment on whether it's an old-fashioned approach from Goldman Sachs, but I think that certainly from our perspective, there's a real opportunity, we feel, to boost productivity by actually creating more flexibility and agility around a number of workplace environments. Undoubtedly, we can boost diversity by creating more flexibility, how often you have to come in the office, the hours you work, etc. But there's not going to be one size fits all. Within our own business, we have 18 different business units that do different things across the commercial real estate advisory landscape. And within those 18 businesses, 18 business units, you're going to have different calls on how people are working. and some people will need to spend more time in the office, and some people won't need to be in the office quite so often. So this is just the importance of really, before you think about making big decisions around your real estate portfolio, before you make these big operational decisions, you do need to have a very clear people strategy, and you do need to engage with colleagues and get the answers that will help inform those decisions, regardless of the industry or sector you operate within.
I mean, it's such an interesting. Oh yeah, certainly go.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in because I've been asked about this constantly, and I've talked to loads of businesses about it. And if anybody out there is waiting for the new model to be published about how you do hybrid working, well, it's not going to come. What's going to happen, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, my bet is there's going to be mass experimentation, and then probably in 6 to 12 months, some winning patterns will emerge. And so I would just encourage everybody to have agency now and make some decisions about your own path to hybrid working based on your own circumstances and the considerations. And then, yeah, it's true, we might discover 6 months from now that some models are better than the other. But don't put off the planning, because everybody, the best thing they can do now is plan what's going to work for their business, and then let's see where we get to.
100%. If anyone comes up and says this is the hybrid model, then they're wrong, and you can't define one hybrid model. So yeah, I agree 100%. As we are still in the laboratory. We are. I'm here working from home today. So it won't be until we get back into the workplace on a regular basis we can really start to define and understand the approach that will be relevant for any business.
Jason, thank you, and Emma, thank you too. It's really it's fascinating to hear the detail, but also the urgency of some of these issues. Really appreciate you making the time. Before we quite finish up, Tony, I just wanted to return to the budget, if I might. And you flagged, and there was some interest in the chat in the 4 reviews, that I can see: listings, fintech, infrastructure, and events. And particularly when the Chancellor announced the findings of reviews, I don't know about you, I often find like I'm hearing the answer, but I've forgotten the question. And I just wonder whether or not, particularly with regard to listing and fintech and infrastructure, what are the problem that the Chancellor is trying to answer, and what you expect those outcomes to be?
Yeah, well, you've put me on the spot there, but I'll have a go. I think, look, the listings review is about how can we make sure that fast growth, innovative companies list in Britain, right? So, we all know that the NASDAQ is the sort of the greatest market in the world if you want to try and sort of list a technology startup business to grow. We have the AIM market here. What more could we be doing to make sure that Britain, and London in particular probably, is as good a place as any in the world to list a new business, to grow a highly innovative business to scale up? That's deeply, deeply important to this government. They really care very deeply about that. I am constantly surprised and impressed at how much time number 10 and number 11 spend on that agenda. The FinTech review is all about how do we take advantage of this potential lead we have in the world in FinTech as a sector. What was the other review? The International Travel Review. The International Travel Review, Grant Shapps is doing an
infrastructure.
I'm forgetting all the reviews. Yeah. So the Chancellor has previously announced plans for an infrastructure bank. And what I think he's going to be doing, some of you will know Chris Grigg, who was the CEO of British Land. Chris has been working, very well known to us, Chris has been working with the Chancellor for the last 6 months in between the announcement of the infrastructure bank and the budget to try and scope exactly what an infrastructure bank is going to do, and some trails over the weekend about the government putting in money with a view to then crowding in private sector money. And this will be important for long-term development of infrastructure, in particular green infrastructure. The events review is not really a review, it's a CBI piece of work we want to do on the events sector to really unpack how we're going to reopen the event sector. One of the things that's quite interesting about the event sector, by the way, is that the event sector is one thing you cannot open quickly. I was talking to some event organizers in the last year and a half, in the last few weeks, and they say, often you're booking events for a year's time. So that's going to be a very interesting one, which is the idea that you can reopen the event sector tomorrow and all of a sudden the next day they're going to be making revenue is false. So those are going to be some of the ends of the reopening of the economy. You're going to look at things like the event sector. So I thought we would do a piece of work on it now.
No, I appreciate that. I know there's so many reviews. You were talking about,
There is so many.
travel and social distancing. But actually, Tony, it's really helpful when you. I don't know about you, but when you sit and you watch the Chancellor at 12:30 on Wednesday, there's often that moment where he's speaking, and if you are in an office with someone, you turn to them and go, "What did he just say? What was that?" And so actually understanding what listings might be, what infrastructure might be, what fintech might be, is really helpful.
Just on that, final thought. I think this is going to be a pretty packed budget, actually. I mean, people think, oh, it's just going to be the COVID budget, he'll extend the furlough and then we'll be done. I mean, the Treasury have been doing a lot of work for a long time that hasn't seen the light of day. Our team have been working with the Treasury on a lot of what's going to be in the budget for months and months and months. So I think actually, I'm sure there'll be some headlines around tax, or I'm sure there'll be some headlines around the furlough scheme or whatever, but this will be a really dense, interesting, unlocking kind of budget. And that's why everybody should join our webinar at Thursday at 10.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, Jason Sidthorpe from Avison Young, and thank you very much, Emma McClarkin from the British Beer and Pub Association. Thank you. Have a very good day and a very good week, everyone.
Thank you.